All right, good morning, everybody. Today is November 12th, and we are still moving right along with Module 6. I hope everyone is doing well. As always, if you have any questions, get in touch with me. When we last left off, we had passed the Compromise of 1850, which was hoped at the time to be the solution for the difficult issue over slave expansion. It didn't really solve anything, but I guess it kicked the can down the road a little bit. Harriet Beecher Stowe had published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a huge seller in the North, but was quite literally banned in the South, which is just a reflection about how this nation is deeply divided over this slavery issue. And I want to reiterate, because you have to keep this in mind. The typical Northerner is not calling for an end to slavery across the board. The typical Northerner is not an abolitionist. The typical Northern attitude is allow states to have slavery if they want it. That's not a problem. Where it exists in the South, that's their business if they want to do it. But as we march west and as we add new Western states, there should be no more slavery. We should not expand this institution. The typical Northerner would argue that slavery is morally wrong. It is economically not really viable long term. Sooner or later, it will have to be dealt with, if not today. That's sort of the general Northern attitude. So assuming that everyone in the North is just an abolitionist Yankee who will take all the slaves away, that's not the way they looked at it. The abolitionists were a very tiny percentage of the population, yet they were extremely vocal. The typical Southern attitude was slavery must be permanently preserved. It is the natural order of society. And that it isn't just that the South and the North both rely on it economically, but culturally it is absurd to think that these non-whites can simply be made free citizens. They are an inferior people, good old-fashioned racism. And of course, by the 1840s, slavery had gone from being sort of this negative. Even Southerners, our founding fathers that were slaveholders, for example, were willing to acknowledge that slavery was bad, even though they didn't get rid of it. But now it is a positive good. It's good for everybody. It's good for whites, good for blacks, good for the nation. They circle the wagons and defend it aggressively. And there just doesn't seem to be any way to compromise this. And this expansion west is forcing it to be addressed because we are adding new states to the Union. And once again, by the 1850s, Southerners are arguing if the federal government goes free, if there are more free state senators, more free state representatives, if the presidents are now being elected that have the typical Northern attitude, if federal judges are now being appointed that don't like slavery, and that would eventually mean the Supreme Court, well, we're just not going to be in this country anymore. We're not going to allow the federal government dictate to us, the southern slave states, what we're going to do with slavery. So this was about federal power over the states, and slavery is the issue. And I'm bringing that up because remember, the tariff was kind of this issue a few years earlier with South Carolina saying the federal government should not dictate to us what the tariff is going to be. The tariff isn't good for South Carolina, yet the federal government is forcing it on us. And South Carolina threatened to secede over that. So the issue is there. Slavery just happens to be a much bigger deal. In 1852, we elected Franklin Pierce as president. And Pierce was an alcoholic. He was ineffective. He did not want to take sides in this publicly. And so we can't really look to the president to provide some sort of leadership to draw compromise. And the same had more or less been the case with Millard Fillmore and Zachary Taylor before. This issue is not creating strong presidents who can lead us through this crisis. This is creating weaker presidents that try to avoid it. Now, we will eventually get a very strong president that leads us through this crisis. We know who he is. We're just not there yet. There is a man by the name of Stephen Douglas. I want to find him. I want to show you a picture briefly. Okay, here we go. We're going to go down a little bit. There we go. Obviously, we know that Honest Abe is on one side of this, but Stephen Douglas, that's him. Going back up. Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois, and he is rising in the ranks of importance. He is ambitious. He is now an influential senator, and Douglas has presidential ambitions. He is not even secret about it. Douglas wants to be president. And he's kind of got that wind in his sails. A lot of people think that he will quite possibly achieve that. Now, keep in mind, in order to be seen as a potential presidential candidate, you have to have more than just the office. You can't just be a senator or a governor or whatever. What you have to also do is develop some sort of track record of leadership, something that puts your name on the map. You have to prove that you are worth the attention. And Douglas is ambitious in this regard. You also, of course, have to keep the people at home happy. You have to keep the people that are voting for you happy. So if you're a senator from Illinois, you got to bring home the bacon to Illinois. You have to find a way to do things that the people of Illinois are going to benefit from. Always remember that. People vote their self-interest. Now let's look at the map of the United States. In the 1850s, we now have California and Oregon territory. We now have the Pacific Ocean. And there had, of course, been talk of a railroad. Sooner or later, we're going to have to connect the East and the West by rail. Everybody knows it. It is going to be a very difficult engineering challenge. It's going to cost a lot of money and just require a tremendous amount of work. But the benefit of a transcontinental railroad is hard to even measure. It will be so substantial. Being able to go from one end of the continent to the other by rail will open the door to so much trade, so much commerce, so much growth, so much money. If you thought the Erie Canal was big, just imagine a transcontinental railroad. And Douglas decides, I'm going to get it done. That's going to be my railroad. My name is going to be on that transcontinental railroad. If I can make that happen, I will cakewalk into the White House. And he's right. Now, there's engineering issues here. Because if we got to build a transcontinental railroad, where's it going to go? And you better believe everybody wants that railroad running through their state. There is tremendous political gameplay in trying to figure out where it's going to go, because it's going to go through some states and it's not going to go through the others. And the states that get that railroad going through will have so much economic potential because they will now be able to do business on both coasts, and you can connect the dots. Now, I want you to look where Illinois is. The actual engineers, the people that know the facts on the ground, pointed out that by far the best route for the railroad was through the south. The territory, the land itself in the Southwest is so much easier to build track on. The farther north you go, you start running into the Rocky Mountains, and building a railroad over the Rocky Mountains is obviously going to be extremely difficult. And so if we're smart about it, we're going to go through the south. That's where the railroad needs to go. It'll be cheaper, it'll be faster, it'll work a lot better. Now look where Illinois is. Obviously, we can't have a railroad going through the south, can we? If we're going to build this railroad, it's got to go through my state. And Stephen Douglas knows it's got to go through Illinois. So what this means is we have to put all of the groundwork in place to make sure that we get the railroad. And the odds are already against us because, again, the cheaper, easier route is not through Illinois. Where am I going with this? Well, you see Kansas and Nebraska territory, right? To build a railroad, we have to settle that territory. We have to establish territorial governments. We have to put our presence there. We have to make that not just the United States on paper, but the United States in practice. Ideally, we're going to turn these areas into states. Not there yet. So in order to get that railroad through Illinois, I got to get Kansas settled. I got to get the West going. In terms of slavery, Douglas, of course, didn't own slaves. Illinois is not a slave state. Douglas was a Democrat, And by now, the Democrats are becoming more of the Southern Party. The Democrats are now pushing more for slavery. Just a spoiler alert, by 1854, the Whig Party had more or less dissolved over the slavery issue. Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs had become so divided that the party itself split and the Whig Party really no longer exists. And Southern Whigs were now becoming Democrats, and Northern Whigs were trying to figure out what they were going to be. Douglas's view on slavery, which has to be addressed if he's going to expand west. If we're going to settle this territory, we got to figure out where slavery is going to go. Douglas argued popular sovereignty. And we mentioned this last time. How about we just let the people in the territory vote? The people in the states can vote whether or not they want slavery. Any state can be a slave state or a free state. That's up to them. So why don't we just allow the people in territories to vote as well? It's not a state. It's under the control of the federal government. But hey, if the people living there want slavery, then the federal government can have it. If the people there don't want slavery, then the federal government will prevent it. This is America, democracy. Let them vote on it. The South is going to agree with Douglas on this. Let the people vote. Because if you look at Kansas, right next to Kansas is Missouri, right? And of course, Missouri is a slave state. So if we open up Kansas to settlement, all these slaveholders from Missouri will flood in. They will, of course, vote to keep slavery, and Kansas will become another slave state. Problem solved. So the South likes this. Yes, popular sovereignty. Let the people vote on it. Also, of course, the North doesn't want this. The North doesn't want the addition of another slave state. Northerners think that Douglas has got a bad idea. The last thing we want is to expand slavery, and so popular sovereignty isn't good there. Now, of course, also what we have to keep in mind is that red line there, 3630. That is the Missouri Compromise line. Y'all remember that? Where we had agreed there will be no slavery in federal territory, north of that line. And so if we allow the people in the territory to vote for slavery, we are voiding the Missouri Compromise. We have decided the Missouri Compromise is no longer valid. And this is frustrating. And so many Northerners cry foul on this. The South had agreed years ago that it would not try to make slavery exist in federal territory north of 3630, and now the South is going back on that deal. So if the South is arguing that we're really just a bunch of abolitionists that want to take their slaves away, so we can't trust them, well, we can't trust the South either. Because the South promised that they wouldn't push slavery north of that line, and clearly the South is doing that. So they're not any more honorable on this. Kansas, Nebraska is going to be fought in over Congress. They scream, they yell, they call each other names. But it passes. So Kansas is now going to be settled. And don't worry about Nebraska. We're not getting into them. Kansas will now be settled. And the settlers in that territory will decide slavery or no slavery. And the presumption, as I mentioned, is that Kansas will become a state soon enough. And as a state, obviously, it will have slavery or not based on its territorial status. Now, what's going to happen after Kansas is opened up for settlement? Well, as expected, settlers pour in. Settlers start pouring in from everywhere. They don't just pour in from Missouri, where slavery is permitted, but they pour in from places like Iowa and Illinois. We want that land, or free enough land, cheap land. At this point, people don't quite know how fertile the land in Kansas is. And that's worth noting because you see, you can't really grow cotton in Kansas. There's not enough rain. I mean, there sort of is, but not quite enough. Kansas is really more suitable for grain crops, corn and wheat, soybeans. And so it's not going to be the same type of agriculture that we see further east, but people don't really know that yet. You know, that's still being figured out. So what we have, of course, is huge numbers of slave owners coming in, bringing their slaves, and huge numbers of non-slave owners, we'll call them free soilers. And as it turns out, they ain't going to be friends. And we end up very quickly with rival settlements throughout the territory. These are not people that are mixing among each other and sort of working it out. The slavery people form their communities. The free soilers form their communities. These groups do not interact. They do not like each other. Both understand that the entire future of our what will be state depends on who wins this. And the free soilers are adamant. We do not want this to be a slave state. And the slaveholders are adamant. We are going to be a slave state. Now remember, you bring your slaves into Kansas. And within a few years, Kansas becomes a state and doesn't endorse slavery, doesn't allow slavery. All of your slaves are now free and you lose all of your property. And so the slaveholders are adamant, we will be a slave state. And the free soilers are adamant that we won't. And I have to also remind you, the free soilers are not necessarily against slavery because they are tolerant people. Many of them are against slavery because they are bigots and do not want non-whites living in Kansas. They want to keep them out. And the way we're going to keep them out is by never letting slavery exist. Many northern states have laws prohibiting black migration. Free blacks cannot move there. And so it isn't just that these people don't like slavery because they think it's wrong. They don't like slavery because they're racist. Of course, violence starts breaking out. Squabbles and fights start happening because this is a very, very tense issue. At one point, a pro-slavery mob, this was in the summer of 1856, went into the town of Lawrence, Kansas. And Lawrence was a free settlement. The people of Lawrence were free soilers. Well, a pro-slavery mob, gang, whatever you want to call it, a bunch of guys that drank too much, rode into Lawrence, Kansas and looted the place, shot out a bunch of windows, did a bunch of damage. Nobody was killed, but the town was sacked, if you will. And this was a rather extreme move. You know, what had been minor squabbles has now escalated into something much more. This was an attack on the town by this pro-slavery mob. And it really angered people, and word spread among the free soilers. You know, these slavers are horrible people. Look what they did to Lawrence. Living in Kansas at the time was a man named John Brown. John Brown was a radical abolitionist, absolutely hated slavery and everything to do with it. Brown openly called for slave rebellion, openly called for the slaves to rise up and kill their white masters, arguing that it would be perfectly just. Brown was also severely mentally ill. And although we can't obviously put him on the couch today, it is now generally understood that he was probably paranoid schizophrenic because he heard voices and firmly believed that people were in the room that weren't there. And so he is deeply delusional. After the looting of Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown, a couple of his sons, and a few other followers went to a pro-slave settlement near what is Pottawatomie Creek. That's supposed to be a W. And I think I'm spelling that right. I think that's an A. Pottawatomie. And there were a few settlers there that were slave owners. They had nothing to do with the events in Lawrence. They were a different group. Went to their cabins in the middle of the night, dragged them out, and hacked them up with machetes. And this would be called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. And after this happened, of course, violence is now popping up all across Kansas as these two groups now start attacking each other. And a new term emerged, Bleeding Kansas. And the idea is Kansas is supposed to become a state, but heck, these people can't even live among each other. How on earth are we going to create a functional state government out of this? And so popular sovereignty turned into a mess. Now, what I'm going to also mention, which I probably ought to go into more detail on, but I'm not gonna, is that there were attempts to create state government in Kansas, because Congress is perfectly happy to make Kansas a state if they can sort this out. And at one point, Kansas would end up with two separate legislatures. The territory, that is. It isn't a state yet. The slave owners would put together their legislature. The non-slave owners would put together theirs, and both would claim to be the territorial legislature. At one point, a proposed state constitution was put together that would preserve slavery. Of course, it went nowhere. One would gradually eliminate slavery. This was called the Lecompton Constitution, where slavery would be permitted but gradually eliminated. That didn't go anywhere either. At one point, they tried to vote, and 4 times more people voted than actually were living in the territory, because people were engaging in all kinds of fraud. In Missouri, what happened is all these slave owners from Missouri ran across the border and voted for pro-slavery right there. So it was just a god-awful mess. So the idea of popular sovereignty and the idea that we can move west and create states without real issues with slavery is clearly not going to happen. The Whig Party, as I mentioned, is now gone. The Whigs cannot sort this out. Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs cannot create a platform that resolves slavery. Southern Whigs would eventually quit the Whig Party and join the Democratic Party. And so the Democratic Party becomes focused on the South and becomes the pro-slavery party. It will still exist in the northern states, but only as a minority party. It will be much, much smaller. And it's worth noting that the Democratic Party will dominate the southern states all the way through the 1960s. The South will effectively be a one-party region. There will be no effective second party in the South. Every senator, every congressman, every governor, every politician from the South will be a Democrat. And this is the case all the way up through the 1960s. So what are we going to replace the Whigs with? What's going to happen in terms of the two-party system? Well, the second party system is done without the Whigs. A new party is going to emerge in 1854. And it's going to grow very, very quickly, and they will call themselves the Republicans. They will call themselves the Republicans. And within just a couple of years, the Republican Party has grown to become a very real force. Now, I want you to understand, the Whigs did not become the Republicans. I've heard that mentioned many times, and it's generally, whenever somebody spouts off some historical statement regarding modern politics. We just had an election, and every once in a while, one of those talking heads on TV will bring up the formation of the Republican Party and all of that, and they frequently will say, well, they used to be the Whig Party, and then they started calling themselves the Republicans. That is not the case. The Republican Party was former Whigs and former Democrats in the North. It was both that joined in the North. And the Whig Party in the South became the Democrats. The Whig Party dissolved. The Republican Party was a hodgepodge of both. And it did have a different platform than the Whigs. The party platform of the Republicans was not the same either. No, it was similar. The Republican Party wanted a stronger federal government, more power in Washington. It wanted to eliminate some of the different sovereignty issues with each state, and sovereignty simply means independence. The Republican Party supported federal spending on internal improvements. Y'all remember we talked about that. And the Democrats, the party of Jackson, very much opposes federal spending on internal improvements. And we have discussed what that's all about before, so we don't have to revisit that. The Republican Party supports a stronger tariff. The Republican Party wants more taxes to be collected on imported goods. Now remember, the South hates the tariff. The tariff is bad for the Southern economy. It's good for the Northern economy. And so automatically, the Southerners want nothing to do with these Republicans. The tariff is bad for the South. But the key anchor of the Republican platform is opposing the expansion of slavery. This is the most important part of what the Republicans are pushing for. Do not abolish it. Leave it legal where it exists, yet prevent it from going west any further. Slavery needs to be contained only where it is legal. Now, this, of course, will lead to the federal government being dominated by free states. There will end up with more senators from free states, more representatives from free states. Generally speaking, presidents from free states. You get the idea. And as far as the Republicans are concerned, that's where the nation is going. At some point, slavery is probably not going to exist anymore. It is incompatible with the modern economy. But the Republicans are arguing we will not abolish it. We just don't like it and don't want it to expand. Immediately, the South is adamantly anti-Republican. Southerners see the Republicans as flat out treasonous. This is not polite political disagreement. This is utter and complete hatred for Republicans and anything having to do with them. There is no Republican presence in the South. There are no Republican candidates. The Republican Party is something that people don't even want to mention. The Republican Party is like Voldemort. It's the party that must not be named because it is seen as anti-Southern. They want to get rid of slavery. They want to raise the tariff. They want to turn the federal government into this big corrupt organization. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Let's just connect the dots. There are many more people living in the North than the South. That's the population numbers are what they are. So this means we will see a greater Republican presence in the North in the House of Representatives. If there are more and more free states added to the Union, they're not going to be Democratic states because the Democratic Party will never support free soil. And the Republicans want spending on internal improvements. And so if they take power, What they're going to do is give themselves all kinds of railroads and canals and ports and all this nice stuff, and the South is going to pay for it. We're going to build a transcontinental railroad across the North, and everyone pays for it, and we don't get the benefit. That's what the Republicans are calling for. And so there's nothing on the Republican platform that the South can get behind. They want to get rid of our slaves, raise the tariff to destroy our economy, force us to pay for their roads and bridges. Why on earth would you support the Republican Party if you were in the South? It's absurd. And you can understand why they hate it so much. And you know what we're going to have to do in 1856? Who wants to guess? Well, what did we do in 1844, 1848, 1852? That's right, we have a presidential election. And there is no Whig Party. The Whig Party doesn't exist. The Whig Party doesn't exist. There is the Republican Party, which is now really gaining steam in the North. There is the Democratic Party, which is overwhelmingly monopolizing the South. There is a third party called the American Party, which tries to find a compromise, and they were nicknamed the Know-Nothings, and it wasn't like they don't know anything, like they're ignorant. It was another sort of goof on their name. But the American Party is actually gaining a certain amount of steam. So divided is the nation on this by 1856 that the voting is different in the North and the South. Like I mentioned, there is no Republican Party in the South. There will not be a Republican on the ticket. You can't vote Republican if you want to, because you don't have a Republican to vote for. The North had James Buchanan as the Democratic candidate, and John Fremont, that Western pioneer who had briefly been the president of the Bear Flag Republic, as the Republican candidate. The Republicans picked Fremont, and Fremont, of course, did not like the expansion of slavery. He was a sort of a popular pioneer figure, and Americans really liked him, so he became the Republican candidate. In the South, James Buchanan was the Democrat, and former President Millard Fillmore was the American Party candidate, and you could vote for him in the South if you wanted to. And the American Party was not that big. The Know-Nothings weren't that significant, but they believed they might be able to pull something off by running a former president on their ticket. You know, Fillmore, of course, had the name and obviously the pedigree in that regard. The problem was Fillmore had been an ineffective president and wasn't especially popular. You know, he was seen as kind of a goof. Now, who was Buchanan? Well, you remember earlier I mentioned that the Secretary of State was a stepping stone to the presidency in the early republic, right? Jefferson had been Secretary of State, and then he became president. Madison and Monroe had both been Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams had been Secretary of State. It was seen as the office you have before you get elected president. And sure enough, James Buchanan was, among other things, a former Secretary of State. More specifically, he had been Secretary of State under James K. Polk. But he was not a strong political figure. He was not someone who was going to show any real leadership on the slavery issue. As a matter of fact, he was from the North. He wasn't even a slave owner himself, yet he was still running as a Democrat. He had always been a Democrat. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out who's going to win the election, right? Buchanan is on the ticket in all the states, but Fremont and Fillmore are only on the ticket in certain states. Obviously, Buchanan's going to win, and that's exactly what happened. James Buchanan won the 1856 election, but there was no realistic chance that he would show any leadership on the slavery issue. He didn't really like to talk about it. He didn't have any connection to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Of course, he had been a Secretary of State, which is foreign policy. So nobody could get mad at him on one side of that or the other. So ho-hum is kind of the best way to think of Buchanan, and he turned out to be a ho-hum president. So how are we going to solve this? What are we going to do? By 1856, tension in Congress is exceptionally high. Here's a picture of John Brown, by the way, and the raid on Lawrence. There's a sketch of what had happened after those looters went into Lawrence and fighting in Kansas. You know, you have two sides, the pro-slave and the anti-slave, and they're not even willing to work together. You know, this image is a sketch of people fighting each other, shooting at each other. People are now going to Congress armed, expecting, I'm not making this up, gunfights to break out on the floor of the Senate or the House any day now. And both the House and the Senate have their own rules of decorum and rules of conduct and rules of procedure. And this is important to keep in mind. Because if you are in the House of Representatives, if you're a representative, you're a representative, and we are meeting in the House of Representatives, you are only allowed to speak on the floor for a certain period of time. If we're debating a bill, you get X number of minutes to come up and express yourself, and then your time is up and you have to go. And as a matter of fact, let's say I have 10 minutes to speak on this bill, and I don't know how much time they get. I should know. And I go up and I say, I like this bill, and I think it's great, and I think we should vote for it, and I've only given 5 minutes worth of speech. I can then give my 5 minutes to you, and I can say I yield the remainder of my time to, my colleague over here, and so you can speak your time plus my time. Time is a credit within the House of Representatives, and the idea there is that we got to get to vote on this bill. When we can only all talk so much time, and then we got to, quit the jabbering and get to voting. So you don't have unlimited time on the floor of the House to talk about what you want to talk about. In the Senate, it's different. Senators are allowed to take the floor and speak for as long as they want. You can give a speech on the Senate floor as a senator just forever. You do not have to yield your time. And also, the leaders in the Senate have the ability to give you considerable leeway in that. And so the short answer is the Senate can take all the doggone time it wants in debating bills. Now, you don't have to write this down, but in more recent years, starting in about the 20th century, senators actually started using this authority to try to kill a bill, and they use what's called the filibuster. Because you see, you also have to have enough senators present to vote on a bill, and you have to have enough senators present to have what's known as a quorum, enough people here to actually have a vote. And so if I really don't like a bill, let's say you're proposing something that, a military bill that I don't want, or internal improvements, and my party doesn't have enough votes to kill the bill, what I can do is a filibuster. And I will get up behind the podium and just keep talking 24/7 until y'all are sick and you go home. And I'm not making this up. When the filibuster was used, they would quite literally put on a diaper and read the phone book, because I can talk about whatever I want for as long as I want. And if enough of you decide to go home or go take a nap or go to the bathroom or whatever, we can call a vote whenever you don't have the numbers and then kill the bill. And more recently, just to let you know, you can filibuster a bill without even having to take the floor. You can just get up in front of the Senate and you can send a note to the majority leader and say, I'm filibustering this bill, and the bill doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's a problem. A lot of people think that's a problem. But the moral of the story here is you can talk for hours. You can talk for days on the Senate floor. Now, why is this important? Well, speeches in the Senate against slavery started getting long, and they started getting ugly, and Senators were really dominating these conversations. Here's some Kansas stuff, by the way. You know, the people in Kansas are picking sides. Some want slavery, some don't, and they're fighting over it. Well, what am I getting at? Let's get back to the Senate and slavery. Charles Sumner was a Northern senator who definitely did not like slavery at all. He could be considered an abolitionist. Now, of course, every congressman and every senator, every politician in the South was a slave owner. And generally speaking, they were large slave owners. They were the planter class. And it was a long tradition in the South to make sure that all of the politicians were in that category. And in no state was this more entrenched than South Carolina. The senators and congressmen and governors of South Carolina were all very wealthy, large plantation owners. And honestly, they just passed these offices around, you know, like a hat. I mean, it's your turn, it's your turn. As a matter of fact, South Carolina didn't even elect its senators until the 20th century. The legislature of South Carolina simply appointed its senators, which it could do at the time. And there was never an issue there that threatened that system. And Andrew Butler was a senator from South Carolina who was a very large slave owner, of course. And he was quite elderly. He was in his 80s. He had had a stroke. He had a very hard time getting around. He probably shouldn't have been in the Senate anymore, but he was. And Charles Sumner in 1856 gave a speech against slavery where he really made a lot of personal attacks. I mean, he really crossed a lot of lines with regards to showing respect to other senators. I mean, he called them very real names and things like that. And again, up to that point, you're just not supposed to do that in the Senate. Do it in the House all day long, but not in the Senate. And during this speech, he made comments about Andrew Butler that were very much inappropriate. Even the Northern anti-slave senators thought this was the case. He made fun of Andrew Butler having suffered a stroke. Andrew Butler kind of drooled when he talked, and Sumner made fun of him drooling. And, you know, let's face it, you don't make fun of people that have had strokes. That's just wrong. That's just mean. It has nothing to do with Andrew Butler as a slave owner, but Sumner really just crossed that line. And the speech went on for like 3 days. I'm not making that up. And it really did ruffle some feathers. Hey, that's the way things go, right? Deal with it. If you can't deal with somebody calling you names, then you probably shouldn't run for public office, right? Well, like I said, these planters in South Carolina passed these offices around, and it's a small class. In the House of Representatives, Andrew Butler had a cousin by the name of Preston Brooks. I don't know how they were related, but I believe they were cousins. Brooks was much younger and obviously healthy. And when Preston Brooks heard that Charles Sumner had said this about his family, he just boiled over. He was absolutely furious. You know, it's one thing to criticize slavery, it's one thing to criticize us, but when you start making personal attacks against my family, a man who has suffered a stroke and clearly is disabled, and you know, you use that as ridicule, you ridicule him. We're crossing lines there, man. Now, think about the South. Think about the kind of culture we're coming from. In the South, if somebody insults you, we're kind of past this age, but still, if you insult Andrew Jackson like that, what's he going to do? If I personally insult Andrew Jackson, what would his response be? Yes. How about he's going to challenge you to a duel? Right? That's what we do. But Preston Brooks decided that Charles Sumner was not worth being challenged to a duel. Andrew Butler couldn't challenge him to a duel. He's too old and enfeebled. So Preston Brooks decided that he's going to have to just quite literally beat some sense into Charles Sumner. Now remember, in the South, if somebody beneath you crosses that line, you whip them, right? And so the next day, after thinking about this, Preston Brooks went over to the Senate, and Charles Sumner was sitting at a desk doing some paperwork. The Senate had just adjourned. Preston Brooks had another congressman with him who was also from South Carolina. He walked over to Charles Sumner. "You have insulted my family, and I intend to correct you." And Preston Brooks just proceeded to beat the ever-living daylights out of Charles Sumner with a cane while he was sitting at his desk. And Charles Sumner's desk was bolted to the floor, so Sumner couldn't even get up. And I mean, he just walloped the daylights out of him, broke the cane over his head. And the other guy that had come with him pulled out a gun and started pointing it at everybody else in the room, threatening to shoot anyone that intervened. Well, needless to say, we've crossed a few lines here. Everyone was infuriated all across the North when this hit the papers. You know, this is just an example of these barbaric Southerners. I don't need to tell you that Preston Brooks was very quickly kicked out of Congress. But in the South, Preston Brooks was a hero. They gave parades for him back home in South Carolina. People gave him new canes to replace the one that he broke over Sumner's head. Finally, one of us taught those doggone Yankees a lesson. And so again, it's a indication of how far we have come. You know, a hero on one side, a villain on another. Congress itself simply cannot work together. Now, Charles Sumner would eventually be able to return to the Senate. It took him a year to recover. It's, of course, very obvious that the Compromise of 1850 has not worked. There is no, I guess what we would say, peaceful or simple solution to whether or not slavery will expand. And by the mid-1850s, the two sides have dug themselves in even further. The South is now openly talking about secession from the Union. And the typical statement from Southerners is that if a Republican wins the White House, you know, the Republicans lost in 56, but if a Republican wins the White House, we're out of here. We're already outnumbered in the House of Representatives because there's so many more Northerners than there are Southerners, and that's a proportionate thing. We're going to add more states to the Union, and if those are free states, the Senate is now going to be controlled by free states. So if a president is from the North and is a Republican, if a president is what we consider to be anti-slavery, he's going to appoint federal judges, we will lose the Supreme Court, and before you know it, the federal government will abolish slavery and we're out of it. So you know what? If a Republican wins that White House, we're done. We're going to secede, we're going to form our own country, a nation of only slaveholding states where slavery is guaranteed in perpetuity, and we will just allow those Yankees in the North to go their own way. And the Brooks-Sumner affair is an indication that the radicals are really kind of taking over here. You know, there are not cooler heads to prevail when it comes to this. And it's kind of obvious that the extremists are more on the Southern side, but nevertheless, the Sumners of the world are not doing anyone any favors. So it's obvious the Congress isn't going to find a solution to this. With presidents like Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan, who will not take leadership roles on it, it's obvious the presidency is not an office that's going to fix this. Well, we have a third branch of government, don't we? We have the federal courts. We have the federal courts. And the good news about the federal courts is that once the court rules, you have to go by it. Somebody always wins and somebody always loses in a court case, and you have no choice. That's the whole point of the courts. The courts are really, if you think about it, the most important branch of government because the courts must be obeyed, and they're that sort of linchpin that keeps everybody following the rules. What does the Supreme Court of the United States have to say about this? And now the Supreme Court is going to get involved. And it's going to get involved on the issue of slave expansion and slavery in federal territories. Now, let me just kind of give you a brief little primer on the court so you can understand what we're dealing with. First of all, the Supreme Court is just part of a larger federal court system. I think I've mentioned this before. There are lesser federal courts under the Supreme Court. There's more than one layer of that. And federal courts are not the same as state courts. And federal courts rule on federal issues, and often they do not get involved in state issues in any way because they don't feel like they have the authority. Federal judges can serve as long as they want. It is a lifetime appointment. So federal judges can often be very old, they can be very cranky, they can be, suffering from dementia. Often it happens, and you know what? If they don't retire, they don't have to. And the reason there is that they should never feel that they could lose their job if they make an unpopular ruling. They can't fear for their job. Their opinion has to be considered immutable, untouchable. The Supreme Court, which is at the top of the federal system, often works very slowly. They take their time. The Supreme Court is a very deliberate body. And Supreme Court justices will choose to take up cases based on important national issues. Every year, hundreds of court cases are appealed to the Supreme Court, but the court only picks a dozen or so to hear. And usually what they're trying to do is answer some sort of important issue. The Supreme Court doesn't take up the issue of, where the property line is between you and the neighbor that don't like each other. We can sort that out somewhere else. The Supreme Court wants to rule on important federal legislation and determine what does the law actually mean. And then their ruling can be used as a model for everyone else to follow. And all of the lesser federal courts are now expected to use the Supreme Court's opinion whenever they rule on the same issue. Set precedents, you get the idea. And the Supreme Court can frustrate people because it'll take them years to sort something out, and they might take 2 or 3 or 4 cases before they finally issue a ruling. Or they might rule on something but not actually answer the question you really want asked. It's just, that's the way they work. And this was the case back then just like it is now. So finally, after many years of looking at what's going on, the Supreme Court is going to take up slavery. Specifically, what about slavery in federal territory? And there's a lot of issues that come along with this, as we have to see. So that leads us to a man by the name of Dred Scott. Now, this case was chosen deliberately. This was not an accident that it ended up in the Supreme Court. That's the point I'm trying to make. They went out and specifically looked for a situation that would give them the ability to make this ruling. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave. At one point in his life, his owners had taken him into federal territory to the north. Now, this was not a state, it was federal territory. And they took him into territory that was north of the Missouri Compromise line, which means they took him into federal territory where slavery is prohibited. Are y'all following me? He was a slave in Missouri who his master takes into free federal territory. Everyone gets me there, right? They stayed there for a while, and then they went back to Missouri, and Dred Scott resumed life as a slave. Well, think about this. When Dred Scott was taken into free federal territory, doesn't that make him a free man? I mean, he's in free federal territory. He is now slavery is prohibited. He is a free man. And so going back to Missouri, Dred Scott could say, I'm free now. So Dred Scott sued in federal court for his freedom. claiming that because I was voluntarily taken where slavery is prohibited, I was freed. Now, it's worth noting, slaves don't exactly have the resources to go to federal court. This was actually kind of a setup. There were people behind this that saw his unique situation and did this for him. And it went to a couple of lower federal courts before the Supreme Court took it up. But that's the issue. Does bringing a slave into federal territory permanently emancipate him if that federal territory is free territory? And the Supreme Court looks at this, and there's a lot of issues that they've got to unpack with this. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a man by the name of Roger Taney. And I will tell you now, Roger Taney was a slave owner from Maryland. Slave owners were overwhelmingly on the Supreme Court, so you can see where this is going to go. Taney was, by any measure, a brilliant legal mind. He's clearly a highly intelligent judge, and he understood the law and the Constitution as good as anyone ever has. And yes, as I said, Supreme Court justices tend to get old and older and older and even older than that. And as you can see with Justice Taney, they never seem to leave. And so, you know, he's looking like the crypt keeper over there, but he's still in charge of the court. That's how it works. All eyes are on the Supreme Court in 1857 because they definitely believe that this Dred Scott case is going to be significant. And yes, it was. Well, the court eventually comes back with its decision. And we are wrapping our head around some legalese here, so please pay attention to me. Please pay attention to me. There's several issues that we have to take up, and the court is complicated. Believe me, these are tricky. First and foremost, an argument could be made that Dred Scott cannot sue in federal court because Dred Scott is not a citizen, and you have to be a citizen to sue in federal court. So right away, Dred Scott loses. Not because there's anything else to rule on, but because you can't sue in federal court anyway. So we're not allowed to take up this issue. And many people pointed out, if the Supreme Court just wanted to answer Dred Scott's personal question, that's all they had to do. Sorry, Dred Scott, you're not a citizen. You can't rule in federal court. You're obviously still a slave. We're not going to free you. That wasn't why the case was brought to the court to begin with, obviously. If that were all that the court was going to do, Dred Scott shouldn't have been there. So number one, Dred Scott is not a citizen. Dred Scott cannot sue in federal court. But that's an important point to make. Because you ask yourself, wait a second, Dred Scott was born in the United States. Isn't everybody born in the United States a citizen? No, that is not true. At this time, the states determined whether or not you were a citizen. The federal government has no say in who's a citizen and who isn't at this time. So each state gets to choose for itself. And for the most part, states had laws stating that blacks were not citizens, slave or free. You are not a citizen if you are not white. Only white people can be citizens. Now, keep in mind, the Supreme Court is the third branch of our government. It's very powerful and it's very influential, but it cannot rewrite state law. All the court is there to do is interpret law, correct? All the court is there to do is say what the law means. And so if the law is very clear, states determine citizenship, Missouri does not give citizenship to non-whites, the Supreme Court says, hey, look, that's what it says. You know, we can't decide otherwise. We don't have the power to tell Missouri you have to be different. And so Taney points that out. This is not a federal issue. Who is a citizen and who isn't a citizen is not my business. But here's where the real meat of the argument comes. And this is what the court did not have to do, but they want to answer this question. Dred Scott, according to the law, is property. That's what he is. Now, you may like it, you may not like it, you may like slavery, you may not like slavery, but the law is the law. And according to the law of Missouri, that man is property. There is a long tradition in this country, dating back to even before we were a republic, that made black people property. Roger Taney points out that it is without dispute that this was a founding characteristic of our nation. To quote him, his words, not mine, our nation was founded upon the principle that the African Negro has no rights which the white man is obliged to respect. Now, that is a disturbing statement. However, I'll ask you, is that correct? Did our founding fathers believe that blacks were equal to whites? No, they didn't. It's just reality. And Taney said, you may like it or you may not like it, but this is the way the United States is. This is what the law says. Slavery is legal, and black people are property. And if you don't like that, change the law. If you don't like that, abolish slavery. Amend the Constitution. Abolish slavery in the states. Do what you want to do. But this is a nation that does have slavery, and the law says Dred Scott's a slave. What about moving Dred Scott into federal territory and thus making him a free man? Taney says no. Taney says that didn't free Dred Scott. Dred Scott did not quit becoming property when he was moved into that federal free territory. Because you see, the federal government doesn't have the authority to arbitrarily seize your property. Uncle Sam can't just show up at your house and take anything you own for no reason. Uncle Sam can't come to your house and take your house. Uncle Sam can't show up at your house and take your tools. Uncle Sam can't come up to your house and take your clothes or your pots or your pans or anything else that you own. Your property belongs to you. And so for a federal law to simply say, you don't own your house anymore, of course we can't have that. And so Roger Taney said that as property, slaves belong to their masters, and it doesn't matter that they are in federal territory. As a matter of fact, banning slavery in federal territory is of itself unconstitutional, because you cannot tell slave owners that they don't own their property. Now, he does point it out, you could do it on a state level. If Dred Scott were sent into Illinois, well, yeah, Illinois could ban slavery, but the Supreme Court doesn't rule on state law, does it? The Supreme Court rules on federal law. So moving Dred Scott into federal territory did not free him. He is a slave. He will always be a slave. He is property, and if you don't like it, change the law. So not only was the Dred Scott decision a definitive Supreme Court ruling, it is giving the South everything they want. This is telling the North there is nothing you can do about this. Slavery can expand west. The people of these states can choose slavery. But stop looking to find roundabout ways to avoid the real truth, which is that this is a bigoted nation that has decided one group of people are worth less than others. Now, what I find very interesting about the Dred Scott decision is that it is frequently attacked as one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made. You know, it told Dred Scott he is still a slave. It was clearly written by a very racist slave owner himself. But the problem that we have with that, and again, I have to ask you, how about an answer here? Was Roger Taney correct when he said this is a nation founded on the principles of slavery? Was he right? Legally speaking, yes, he was. You don't get to say we were not a slave-owning nation. You don't get to say the Constitution is not a slave-owning document. You don't get to say the Founding Fathers didn't like slavery. They did. And so accepting the truth of how our nation is founded is going to have to mean Roger Taney, as unpleasant as it is, was actually correct. The Dred Scott decision was not legally wrong. It was morally abhorrent, but it was legally correct. You want to free Dred Scott, you got to end slavery. You have to decide that everybody's equal. That's the only way that we can do this. We as a nation have to decide we're not going to do this anymore. It's going to take a lot more than just a court ruling. Well, as I said, boy, this is controversial. In the North, they are furious. They are blowing over mad. Steam is coming out of the ears of the Northerners because slavery can now expand in any federal territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The South gets everything they want and is absolutely insisting, yes, this is our rights, and slavery will now expand, and the Southern states will no longer feel hinged in by these arbitrary federal laws. Neither side is necessarily going to sit down and work on it. The North is now becoming more Republican than ever. Membership in the Republican Party skyrocketed after the Dred Scott decision. As I mentioned, we now see more and more fighting in Kansas. That Lecompton Constitution, which would have made Kansas a slave state, even if it gradually got rid of it, that's now going to take place as a result of this. In 1858, Kansas tried to become a state, but Congress wouldn't admit it. There was too much fighting in Congress. With northern states refusing to admit Kansas as a slave state, and southern states, southern representatives and senators insisting that they do it. In February of 1856, during the whole debate over whether or not Kansas would be admitted, on the floor of the House of Representatives, debate over this had gone well into the evening, and neither side was willing to leave because they were worried that if we leave, the other side will vote and we won't get what we want. And have I mentioned already that we drank a lot more alcohol back then than we do now? Of course I have. Well, a lot of alcohol was being drunk on the floor of the House at this particular time. It was freely drank before this and after. And at one point, one representative named Galusha Grow, I believe he was from Wisconsin, staggered into Lawrence Kite, a representative from South Carolina, again, and Lawrence Kite kind of shoved him out of the way. And Cadwallader Washburn, you got to love these names, a representative from Wisconsin, said something to the effect of, I'm not going to let some South Carolina overseer push my friend around, something along this. And before you know it, a full-scale, old-timey brawl broke out on the House of Representatives. And everybody starts punching each other. The South and the North just go at it, free-for-all, gang style. I mean, people are slapping each other, spittoons are, being thrown across the room. It was utter and complete chaos on the floor of the House of Representatives. At one point, Washburn went to punch William Barksdale, the representative from our state, the Mississippi representative. And Washburn grabbed Barksdale by the top of the head and took a swing at him, and Barksdale dropped down, and Washburn was left holding his hairpiece, his toupee. And so Barksdale looked and went, give me that. And he grabbed his hairpiece and he put it back on his head, but he put it on backward. And everybody in the house took one look at him and just started laughing their butts off at William Barksdale. What are you doing? With his hairpiece, his toupee on backward. And that's what ended that fight. And I don't know why I told you that story, except it's ridiculous and an indication of where we have become, where we have gone. So what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? The Supreme Court has ruled on this, but the Supreme Court's ruling is not respected by anybody. Congress is too busy fighting each other and beating each other up over it. Buchanan wants nothing to do with the slavery issue. The president is inept in the White House, as had been the others. And Southerners are now insisting that if we elect a Republican to the White House, we will secede from the Union and form our own country. And maybe now we could throw in a good old-fashioned slave insurrection on top of all of it, led by a paranoid schizophrenic who had just killed a bunch of people in Kansas. That'll make the situation even easier, right? Well, John Brown is going to come back in the picture now, and in the height of all of this, ramps it up even more. But on that note, what do you say we end it? Because I don't want to talk about John Brown's reign today. We don't have enough time. Y'all take care, and I will see everybody on Tuesday.